Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's SagePresence webinar, Elevate Your Interviews, Insights from Selection Committee Members. My name is Troy Parkinson. I'm with SagePresence, and I'll be moderating today's panel discussion. We're very excited to have you here today, as well as our panelists, for this insightful conversation as you prepare for upcoming interviews, and hopefully these tips will help you as you enter the new year. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, feel free to ask questions throughout the process through the Q&A box in the webinar options, as well as through the chat box. I'll be monitoring that throughout this experience, and I will interject those questions when they seem right. Otherwise, we will circle back around to the Q&A at the tail end of our panel discussion today. Also, if you are watching this and for some reason need to drop off, or you are not able to attend the whole experience, please feel free to know that we will be recording the session, and I will be sending you an email link following this by the end of the week with a recording of our session as well. You can also find that at sagepresence.com. So with that, I'd love to introduce our panelists today. First of all, we have Heather Leidy from the Director of Airport Development with Metropolitan Airports Commission. She'll be joining us today. We also have Edric Kwan, the City Engineer with the City of Martinez, California. And we have Maura Donnelly, the Principal University Architect and Planner with the University of Wisconsin Preservation Officer. So let's begin. We have a lot of questions that we want to dive into our panelists with, so we will begin right off the bat. Each of you comes from a different industry, and I would love to know from each of you what type of projects you are interviewing architect, engineer, and construction teams for. Why don't we start with you, Maura?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for asking me. The projects that I'm involved in are higher education, university architects for the entire University of Wisconsin system. That means all the campuses, Madison, Green Bay, La Crosse, 13 of them. I'm involved in interviews, or we have formal interviews, shortlisting, screening interviews for projects over 7.4 million. That's on the low end, and it's extremely rare that we even have projects that low. Majority of the projects these days are over 100 million. And so in the past year, I've interviewed for $150 million engineering building, $120 million chemistry building, a $200 million engineering building, and even I think I will eventually be interviewing for a $12 million plaza development. So over 7.5, but all higher education.
Excellent, wonderful. How about you, Edric?
Hi, well, with the City of Martinez, we're a fairly small size agency. We consist of about 70,000 people. And because of that, the scale of our projects are much smaller. We provide quite a suite of different services when it comes to infrastructure. So we have plenty of projects that are involved with our water treatment plant, our roads, or our utilities. We have a marina, we have many parks, one of the most parks per capita in California. And so with that, there's quite a variety of different projects that we do put out. And because we are such a smaller size community, our project size is much smaller than the University of Wisconsin. But nonetheless, we want to bring on board the most qualified and experienced team on our projects. So that said, when it comes to the types of projects we like to go into, let's say the interview stage, typically I would flag those that are complex or highly political, because at the end of the day, our constituents are looking at every single project and we want to be transparent. So we do that quite a bit. A lot of times because we're a small service city, I lack staff as well as subject matter experts. So bringing on talented staff augmentation roles is also the types of interviews I also conduct.
Wonderful, thank you. And Heather, how about you? What kind of programs and projects have you recently interviewed for?
So we're a little bit unique to my co-panel members. The Metropolitan Airports Commission takes care of the MSP, Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, as well as 6 reliever airports. And rather than selecting our design and construction teams on a per project basis, we select a continuing consultant model. So now that's construction coordinator. The general contractors we do a straight up low bid, design bid build process. So those contractors are per project, but the consulting firms that we hire are on a typically 6 or 5 year contract to help us with any of the projects within our capital improvement program. That program is about $2 billion for the 7-year program, fluctuates a bit. And we've had several years recently that were over or close to $500,000 for a single year's contract awards. But those projects obviously start a ways in advance of the awarding of contract. So we do selection for architecture firms. We select for our civil engineering, especially our mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and also construction coordinators. So contractors in town who help us with more project management and site supervision work from the owner perspective to help us with that. So we do it in those larger buckets, and then we can pick from our team of selected consultants for any of those projects as we go forward through the years.
Excellent. Obviously, we're all coming to you here today via Zoom in this virtual world. I'm curious from each one of you, and Edric, you can start first on this question. I'm curious to know how the pandemic has changed the way you interview teams. Have you shifted all the way to virtual now? Are you still doing in-person interviews, or is it a hybrid experience on occasion?
Yeah, we're still very much into the virtual scene as far as interviews go. And that's something that I believe is going to stay put moving forward with how the city conducts our interviews. And so it's all virtual at this point. No longer do we need physical materials as part of the presentations. No more presentation boards, none of that. But that said, it's a unique way for us to be able to now assess our teams, and also, quite frankly, it's been really efficient in being able to go through this process now without having all the physical constraints that we would normally in a non-COVID environment.
Excellent. How about you, Maura?
I'm not surprised that Edric's talking about it continuing on. Right now, the Department of Administration is the construction authority for all UW projects. They have 5 members of a selection committee, and 2 of them are UW voting members. So they organize the interviews and they structure the interviews. And I have a deep feeling that they're going to continue on that way. They're very busy people to get 5 of them together for one whole day. And they often pivot in between these interviews, and oftentimes maybe during the interview, to deal with other pressing matters that come up, which is, I think, very unfortunate for the consulting team out there to not have the 100% attention. So I believe it's going to continue. We even had to hold virtual walkthroughs because we often, for these larger projects, we want to bring the team to the site 2 weeks in advance to walk through an existing building. Often we just walk through and look at an empty lot. I don't know why we all meet, but now having a virtual walkthrough, sometimes we've taken cameras through basements, and sometimes we've scheduled times, no questions to be asked, no inside information gathered as you're walking through the basement of an existing building to get a sense of the existing condition. But often it forces me to force our campuses to have a PowerPoint to present their overarching ideas, their the themes of the project, what they're looking for as part of, I guess, a presentation and a vision of the project that often doesn't quite get nuanced or detailed in perhaps the generic structure of the request for services, which we often get from legislative documents that we submitted to request the project to begin with. So they're pretty dry, hard to infer content. So these virtual walkthroughs prior to the interviews, I think, are very helpful.
Excellent. How about you, Heather? What's your experience at the airport?
So we switched to virtual interviews this year. 2020, we were lucky to have a little break in our selection processes. We we cycle through so we don't select all the consultants, all the types of consultants at the same time. So we had a year off for 2020, which was fortunate as we were all trying to figure out, we're almost exclusively on Teams here at the MAC. And so we've all been getting used to Teams meetings in general, and then figuring out how to do that for an interview. We thought we were on the verge of offering the option to the teams if they wanted to come in person or not. And then numbers started getting worse again at about the time we were scheduling those first interviews this year. So we decided to go 100% virtual. I sense that we're missing in-person interaction so much here that we will probably go back to in-person interviewing in the future. But we're not ready to call our whole staff back to the office yet. And until we're comfortable to do that, I don't think we're going to be comfortable to bring in consultants for those interviews when we can do it more safely on a virtual platform.
Yeah.
And it worked honestly better than I expected. So that was good.
Well, that's good. That's good. You know, this virtual environment can be both a blessing and a curse, as we've heard. But I'm curious to know from each of you, what are some of your virtual, for lack of a better description, pet peeves when it comes to virtual interviews? Are there things that firms are doing that are not working? Do you personally all like virtual backgrounds? Do you care about the tech side of it? Do you want to see moving video on a Zoom call? I'll put it this way. What is the one thing that you like to see out of a virtual interview? And what is one thing that you've seen over the years now, or over the last year and a half, that you really recommend people try to avoid in a virtual interview? And Maura, you can start on this one.
One of the problems that we had is the construction authority, the Department of Administration, mandated that all interviews be on the platform they were more familiar with, which was Teams. I use Teams every single day, but I really think that Zoom has a better opportunity to have more thumbnails of all the participants up on the screen at the same time and see them, just like you would see the 12 members of a team sitting around a table in the front of the room in an interview. And that's really unfortunate. I tried to get them to let their interviewee determine the best platform for them. I understand the whiplash of 4 different platforms and all day interviews with 4 different teams. I wish it would be Zoom. So that being said, is just like in an in-person interview, I'd like to see not just the faces of the 4 people who most recently spoke, but I'd like to have the 12 members on the team somehow up on my screen. And I've heard from them that they're not the biggest fan of these virtual interviews because they can't gauge our reaction to what they say, our enjoyment or our frowny or our, whatever we're thinking when we hear something that we start scratching our head. They can't read that at all because we're all off screen. So that is unfortunate. I think one of the virtual backgrounds, me right now, I don't think you want to see my upper office. But I have wild hair and it tends to blur. And as I move and pivot, I think I can probably drive people crazy. So maybe a better background. Please, no masks. I know some people work together and they're presenting at the same table and they have a mask. Go into your office, take off the mask. I'm not doing the virtual world, so I can listen to you through a napkin. So those are some of my pet peeves. But I think that there's pluses. I think it's helpful in a virtual interview to have one sort of lead. Whoever the lead person, it doesn't have to be the principal of the firm. It doesn't have to be the head marketing person of the firm. It may be helpful to be the job captain or the chief architect project manager, sort of be the resource that kind of goes back to, and they pivot off to the next presentation and they pivot off to the next presentation. So the commonality of that one person that's going to speak the majority of the time and showing that they're managing the team virtually as well as they'd be managing the room virtually in an in-person interview.
Excellent. How about you, Heather?
I don't know that I have a preference whether it's a virtual background or not. Some of the teams, everybody had the same one. Some of them, I had a mix of there was a virtual background and then somebody was in their office. And so I think the variety with when there were some virtual backgrounds was a little bit strange. Personally, I figured out because, well, I recently got my hair kind of shortened up a little bit, but as you saw from my earlier picture, I also have a lot of curly hair, which is very difficult for virtual backgrounds to manage. In the work from home, I learned, and I bought a fairly cheap green screen piece of fabric that I can string up between two bookshelves in my home office, hides all my clutter, allows the virtual background to work better without that quite as much of the weirdness around your head. We joke about it almost all the time in our meetings here at work that bald men have the most success with virtual backgrounds because it's a nice clean line for that to work. So that can be a little distracting. I've kind of gotten over it though too. It's just part of how it works. So that hasn't been too bad. I think my one pet peeve from the virtual interviews that we did was when someone had audio malfunctions. So somebody had a headset that they were just so determined to use, but it was causing all kinds of weird static and breakup. And it's difficult both as the selection panel and even their teammates to break in and say, hey, we can't hear you. And so they tried a couple things and then they unplugged and kept going. And I was like, okay, great, we're just going to be unplugged. Next time it came around to him, he tried to plug it back in. I mean, they may very well have done a tech rehearsal and it all worked fine. And that day it didn't work. I totally get that that happens. But to have something in the team where you've got some way to give a signal, send a little text message, something to say, unplug it and leave it off because it's not working. I feel like there needs to be some way to communicate. And it's also okay to me if you do that in front of me. To some degree, as the selection panel, I need to offer you some grace that this is weird. And things happen. And I'm more interested in how well do you manage that? So I had another team where one person's audio, as they came on, failed completely. And they had to restart their whole computer. Well, the team was prepared that someone else on the team could present that information while the computer restarted, and then he could rejoin and be part of the conversation. And we didn't miss the content. And we were able to get to know the person also just at a different time in their presentation, but they were well enough rehearsed to be able to kind of roll with that. Not everyone was that adept.
Excellent, excellent.
They may have had some coaching from you.
Well, we do encourage folks to definitely rehearse at least once, twice, 3 times is great, but it all depends on people's schedules. Edric, I'd be curious to know how the technology pet peeves that exist for you, if any.
Oh, you might not know, but my green afro right now with the green screen, it just, you can't see it at this point. But yeah, Mara and Heather both chimed in and actually said a lot of the things I would have said too, especially as it relates to different types of virtual platforms to use and just not being familiar with them. So in my case, I've always used Teams whenever I set up different interviews, and that was with the previous agency. And Zoom was used mostly for the public perspective. Now with the city of Martinez, we do use Zoom. A lot of it is so that we, at least as the interview panelists and controlling the actual interview, we know what we're doing. If we have the interviewee use their platform, then we found that that could be challenging on our part. You know, the pet peeves I have really pertains to both virtual as well as in person. Mara spoke about making sure you have the right person that is representing the team. And it's a big pet peeve when I have the owner or the lead marketer talk about the company and the details when they're not really going to be doing the work. So I very much express who I want on the interview on the other side. And if they're going to have the marketing person or the owner, that they're limited to speak only on certain things. And I do want to hear from the people themselves. Another pet peeve is really about understanding how to present oneself in this type of environment, lighting, camera angles, the sounds, making sure that you don't have dueling ambient noise from the background. All those things really matter because we want for them to present themselves the best. And when you can only partially see them or partially hear them, it really does them a disservice. So I would say those are a few of the things that I do look into when it comes to pet peeves of mine.
Thank you. Thank you. A quick note to everyone who's watching. If you do have questions that you'd like to ask or something triggers for you, please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat window. I am monitoring that throughout. So if a question pops into you and you don't want to forget it, feel free to drop it in there. We'll come to it at our Q&A. Next question for you all has to do as it relates to proposals. So I'm curious to know, in your interview process, do you have a formal proposal that's sent to you as well as an interview? And if so, do you like to have some repetition in what they're communicating in the proposal to match the interview? Similar theme, similar story, or does it not matter to you that they match? Edric, you can start this time.
Sure. I always go through some sort of RFP, RFQ process. And the individuals that review those proposals and then shortlist the firms that go on to the next stage of interview. Sometimes my interview panel doesn't match up with those that are reviewing the proposals. So what I do for the firms is I provide a structure for them so that they know exactly what I want for them to present. And many times I do want for them to reiterate certain parts of the proposal because they'll now have a new audience. And that audience may not have really vetted through their entire proposal yet. So there is some value for them to at least highlight parts of the proposals. I also many times like to also provide them an exercise in advance just to really help me assess and for them to demonstrate that they do know what they're doing. So that's a technique I use quite often. That is very different from what we receive from the proposal and in the interview stage. Sometimes I might provide to them in advance what types of questions I'll be asking or what types of subjects specifically I want them to focus on in their interview. And then for our interviewees, I make sure that when we score them, all those elements are included in their evaluation sheets so that it is fair and we're really comparing apples to apples with all of the different firms that we interview.
Excellent, thank you. Heather, what's your take on that?
Oh, Troy,
Troy
froze up?
I think he froze.
Can you hear me now?
Troy, we've lost your picture, we think, or you froze, but we heard you call on me.
Okay, yes, go ahead, Heather.
Oh, here you're back. So here, a classic example of how these things go, right? We definitely do a proposal first. We put out a request for qualifications and take in those statements before we shortlist for interviews. I tend to have the same group review the SOQs and then do the interview panel. Occasionally we'll end up substituting one or two people if schedules just get out of hand or someone leaves the organization and we need to replace them with someone from their department. But we're usually picking from our various stakeholder departments to help us out for the sort of most relevant and most interaction with whichever consultant group we're selecting. I don't mind a little bit of repetition as long as it's more of an underscoring or more detail or something like that. I don't really want, I'm not interested in having someone essentially read me their proposal. I think that we get the gist of those sort of quantifiable skills that can be sent in print, and our interviews are about how are they going to be to work with. And So that's where having the people you're really going to have assigned to the teams, or at least leading the teams, is really important to us, so that we know who we're working with and how are they to interact with, how are they for responsiveness to our questions as we go. We do give some structure to what we expect, what the timing is going to be for the interview process. And we did second interviews as well. So we got through the first one that was kind of that general. We had pre-prepared some questions to ask everybody, because we wanted to sort of see, okay, how's everybody on these same topics? And then for second interviews, it's where we dive a little bit deeper, and we have follow-up questions on these things that you said, and we'd like to know more about that. And we kind of gave them that ahead of time. We had much shorter second interviews. So we wanted them to be able to be focused on those things that we wanted to know more about. But then it got to be more unique by the firm, so that we could really get into, what do they mean by this thing? Or how does that really apply to us? Or something like that.
Excellent. And Maura, same question.
Very similar, but somewhat different. We're a little more structured in our RFP. Is very structured, and the response, the statement of qualifications. We were getting proposals that over 100 pages, and we had to put a stop to it. And the AE community came, and together with the agencies and the Department of Administration, we worked on a format, nothing more than 15 pages, lots of thumbnails in 15 pages. But the most important aspect of our submittal process was modeled after the federal 330 form, where that second page where you align the whole team on the left and you align the qualifying projects on the top, and you check the boxes of the team members who've worked on projects. And that is the most important aspect for me to look at in shortlisting. So I get 10 of those or 12 of those, and we need to get down to 4. So I got to find a way to throw 8 of them under the bus, so we can only minimal interview, or maximum of 4 interviews. So it's a very structured format, and that's the most important aspect of me that I want to know this leader, this designer, this programmer was the actual one who's worked on the projects that you put out there as qualifying projects that say you can handle this type of work, and not 100% that you've worked with some members of these teams before in different aspects. It might be just one member from the architect team had worked with this engineer before. It's also very important, if we have specialty, we like or desire specialty consultants, that we know who the food service consultant is, who the lab consultant is as well, and see that they've played well with others in the sandbox in the past. Then we shortlist it down to the 4 or less that we want for the interview. And then the interview is very structured, 45 minutes for presentation, 15 minutes for Q&A, and a series of questions that they have to address. And a lot of times they want to breeze over who's going to be the construction on site and how many site visits and all that unsexy stuff. So, but they often get held up if it's like, well, they never really address this and they never really address that. So we often like them. They used to give us these whole, takeaways, placemats, lots of printing, lots of expenditure and printing for the takeaway. And oftentimes what we were left with is, I just wanted in the question and answer to go back and look at the budget. And my number one pet peeve is, don't make me do math. Don't throw, oh, we think this is $450 a square foot. What does that mean? Are we at 120 million or are we at 98 million? So big numbers. And so it is a very, very structured process, and the interview, they want you to answer the questions. And sometimes and just like what Heather said, we're more interested, you've gotten there. We know any one of you 3 or 4 can do the job. You obviously had the qualifications to knock 8 players off of the interviews. It's more of a, how are you going to roll up your sleeve and tackle this problem. We don't want them to do design. We don't ask them to do design, but we ask them questions like, do they think the budget's adequate? And, is the scope, and that's a little hard to answer sometimes without
Sure.
saying, what, are they kidding? What are they smoking this budget? You can't build that. Oftentimes our budgets are bigger. We've put out larger budgets to build in escalation, and the AE community has understood that, and they've been very reasonable to come back and say, well, that budget's a little high, but if we bid it and construct it at this time period, we think you're right on the mark.
Excellent. Well, we've had some questions come in from our audience, and so I want to hammer through a few of these because they're relevant to the topic we're talking to. First of all, just quickly, each of you, if a team reached out to you for a debrief on their proposal before the interview, is that something you would all do, yes or no? I get some head shaking all around. So I'm going to assume that's a no, because not everyone would have the same, because you want it to be consistent for everyone, correct? Lots of head shaking yes to that one. Okay, moving on to the next question. How many hours do you think teams put into the proposal process from RFP through interview? And I can speak to that probably from a coaching perspective, but I'm curious to know, each of you, based on all of your years' experience in this, can you tell when teams have put the time into it versus those that just show up and wing it? Heather, go ahead. You can share first, maybe.
Certainly, I think for the most part, the statements of qualifications I see, you can tell that they put effort in. And there are ones where there are also telltales when they didn't put quite enough, and maybe they only needed an extra 10 minutes, but putting the vision statement for a completely different airport into your cover letter to my airport, not a big gold star for you. Ones where you don't go into any detail of the experience because you assume that I know some things. I can tell that wasn't quite enough time. Now, it could be you had one person in your firm saying, we've got to go after this. And you had somebody else saying, there's no way we're going to get this. I don't want to put a ton of time into it. That's fair. That might be fair. If they had put more in, would they have gotten on the interview list? Maybe. I can't tell for sure, but there are times when I can tell when they haven't put at least kind of the average amount of effort in. And then there are ones, every once in a while, one really stands out where I'm like, they put a lot of effort in. I can't tell you time, but I can tell you that they paid attention and they had a strategy for how to stand out. And that's really visible to me in the, now PDFs that I get. And then I think similarly in the interview, how smooth are they transitioning? What story do they want to tell me? And are they telling it well as a team? You can tell how much effort they put into preparing for that as well.
Anything from either of the two of you? Anything to add to that?
Because our proposal is so structured, and with very specific, here's where to insert the project, here's the number, the dollar value, here's who the leader is, that the effort is there. I think the only reason that you would fail to get shortlisted is we also have a point system that can sometimes knock you out, status points of projects that you have, distance from the job site that doesn't make that great of a degree. Sometimes people have so much work that no matter what they do, they're never going to be shortlisted. They get tossed out automatically. But the more important is, like I said, that one table formulated on the 330 of showing that the team has all the components. They have the food service consultant, they have the lab consultant, and that they've played in the same arena in the past. And then again, just like Heather said, in the actual interview is the handoff. I've had interviews where Starkitects flew in from New York City, and I walked out between interviews to go to a restroom to see the Starkitect shake hands and introduce himself to the in-state architect, 2 minutes before they walked on stage for the interview. So that's, that it showed in the interview that they really didn't interact before. They maybe had some conference calls. Now with virtual presence, you can get a sense that they can do that work. We've heard from architect communities that in the past, in the pre-virtual interviews, that they've spent between $10,000 to $20,000 on each interview, between the flying, the marketing, the timing, the getting things together, traveling if they bring in national firms from a distance. Now with everything being virtual, I'm hoping that that's getting less. We don't like people to do that. So hopefully that's tamped down a bit, and that they're using the virtual world to build the team. I want to see a team who went out and had beers the night before. I don't want to smell it on their breath. I want to know that they, had some team bonding, some trust falls or something like that, that they really get along and they answer each other's, or they finish each other's sentences.
Yeah, that's great. Let me pose another thought to this, and then Edric, I'll have you respond to this question first. You talked all of you, a little bit about those team dynamics, those handoffs. Two questions that I want to combine here from individuals in the audience. One is, do you like the Q&A to come sporadically throughout the presentation, or are you locked in to do the Q&A at the end? So for example, if they finish a section, do you like interaction where someone asks, do you have any burning questions right in this moment? And the second thing is, are there anything about interviews that have gone above and beyond? Like, do you have an example to share about a team that really excelled in their interview? So Edric, I'll start with you.
Sure. So when it comes to these, could you repeat that last part again? It was more.
Sure, yeah. So the second part of that question, are there any teams that stood out above and beyond? And two, do you like to see a Q&A spread out throughout the experience, or just at the Q&A section of an interview?
For me, I'm always trying to make sure that I play fair for each of the firms. And so what I found is if I'm interjecting questions throughout their interviews, it could throw them off, or perhaps they consider to answer that question later as part of their interview. So I do try to structure it in the sense that we do have a section for Q&A at the very end, as well as a free-flowing portion after that as well. That'll give us a time to at least go back to the interview if they missed something. But for me, it's really about not throwing off their game, making sure that they're able to perform the best they can, and see that type of team dynamic that we talked about earlier. So those are very important for me. Things that really stood out with a great interview, we mentioned earlier about just the team dynamic, and you can really tell when a team has worked with each other quite a bit, as they can bounce off of each other, they can reference back to other examples that they've worked on together. Those are things that really make the interview sing. Other than that, what I found when a firm is really invested into the project and they really want it, I've seen firms go above and beyond and even have done some of the work in advance and provided some solutions for us to consider. And that's also a really great experience to know that they're really interested and they've already invested some of their own professional experience into the project for us at the interview stage.
Excellent. How about you, Heather? Do you like interactive questions in the middle of the process? And what interviews have stood out to you and why?
So I think I'm with Edric on the interview they get to do a presentation and then we do the Q&A. We use the second interview to follow up on questions in the presentation. Really, our Q&A is, we already know we have these questions we want to hear from all the firms about. And so that first interview is really a more structured Q&A and is separate from the presentation. We sometimes leave a little bit of room at the very end if we want to touch on something inside the presentation. We'll take notes as we go. But I also really like keeping that for the second interview. If we're down to, I'm just not sure which way I want to go with this, or I might want them both, but I need to know more about this thing before we pick those two. Again, we are choosing for continuing consultants that sort of on-call selection. So it's a little bit of a different process than picking one team for one project. One interview that really stood out for me in the last year was And I think that they did this in a way that would have allowed them to see our reactions, but we had established our rules of etiquette were going to be during the consultant's presentation, we would be cameras off. Most of us have different screens. So my camera's on my laptop, but I had a bigger screen. Well, when they're presenting a slideshow, I want it on the bigger screen. So I'm going to look over here, and that's going to be dumb. And it just felt like this will be, it's not ideal for them not to get our reactions, but it's also sort of even. Well, we had one team who, instead of just doing a slideshow, had one person kind of running production, popping a slide up to introduce a topic, to illustrate the thing they were presenting. And then it would go away while the person talking could sort of come to the front and I could see the face of the person talking to me. And then if they wanted to refer to the slide, I don't know if they had hand signals or something, some little buzzer to each other's offices, but then the slide would pop back up. And it wasn't like, hey, Michelle, can you pop that up again? It was just smooth. I mean, this was the most polished presentation that I saw. But I liked that back and forth. I've got a slide, now I've got a person talking to me about it. And the team rotated who was doing what, but those slides kept popping up. I thought that was really unique to what I've seen. And possibly had I known, I might have had our cameras stay on, but that might have then been unfair. So that was a little bit tricky and I didn't know to expect it. I don't know that I would expect it. It's not that's not an easy presentation technique, I don't think. But they did it really well.
Excellent, excellent. I'm going to keep moving on with a couple of other questions here. One of the key ones that I want to get to is this idea of slides versus faces. When we work with teams, and circling back to a question earlier and how much time people put in, traditionally when we coach teams for interview preps, SagePresence will work with a team for 2.5 to 3.5 days in preparation just for that interview. So that could be spread out over the courses of small doses virtually. We've also been live with people working on it in a pre-COVID world, but even now as live interviews come back. But there is that balancing act in a virtual environment where how much do you show the slide and how much do you see the face? So Maura, I'm curious to know from you, do you like a slide intensive presentation or are you wanting to make a connection to the human that's actually going to be doing the work for you?
Because all my interviews are on Teams at the moment, it really, it's how that platform is. So there's usually, and again, that's the controller or the viewer. If somebody's sharing a screen and it's up there as a slide, I would like it so that the slide was 3/4 of the screen and the presenter, I saw their face and their, direct communication. I don't know if Teams allows that. I think Zoom was a little better with that. But then again, I would also like to see not only the one person speaking, but the 4 or 5 other people below them or who's, all kind of on that same topic. I think the slide is important, but it depends on the context. Are they talking about the budget? I want to be able to zero in to the budget table when they're talking about the budget as opposed to the next slide where it's maybe generic and has, the fluffy slide, where they use buzzwords and talk about images of campuses and students walking around sites. Yeah, not that interested in that. Maybe that's where the person pops up versus the slide that has the schedule or budget or something very specific or square foot table that want to pinpoint and I want to look at what they're saying and say, oh, okay.
Excellent. Edric, how about you?
Yeah, I believe that the slides are important as well, but they really are just to serve as a guide, not throwing up everything there and we're looking at the slide instead of the person speaking. So it should really guide us through the presentation. It should highlight the things that they want us to remember. They should show pictures or things that they want to use to illustrate their point, and use the slides for that purpose, not as the interview. Because I do want to focus on the individuals and how they present themselves and to provide the details versus relying just on the slides. So that's how I see the difference between the slides. And
Very good. I want to shift to another topic that is very important across industry. It's a national conversation, and that's one of diversity and inclusion. And I would love to know from each of you how your industries, and particularly your departments, are navigating diversity and inclusion as it comes to the interview process itself and or the actual team that is going to be working on the project. So for each of you, how do your departments and your industries embrace diversity and inclusion? And I'll start with you first, Heather.
This has been a little bit of a tricky thing. I would say we're evolving. I don't think we've figured it out yet. It matters. We're much better able to set specific goals for using TGB or DBE contractors in our bidding process, because we can say X% of this contract value must be. When we're doing our continuing consultant selections, it's harder to say, I need this percentage of some unknown value, right? So to date, we haven't put any hard goals on that selection process. We did this year tweak our RFQ a little bit to ask for them to address what are their diversity goals or programs or plans that they have. And that was a really broad, what we would accept, but we needed them to acknowledge. And sort of what is their staff makeup and how does that fit, of what level in the firm do you have people of these demographics? We got some of those statistics, but it's not been a firm requirement yet. I'm not sure that will hold. I think that we'll move towards a stronger request. We certainly have firms who partner with smaller firms in the area, sort of as sub-consultants. Sometimes that gets presented in the selection process, sometimes not. Sometimes it just happens as we're working on projects. They're like, hey, we have this opportunity to bring in another firm, either to sort of help them get experience here and potentially be a competitor in the future if they've got the capacity. But sometimes they're so small, they would never compete for the full continuing consultant, but they can consistently support some of those larger teams and do specific parts of projects. We're also starting to look at different delivery methods. We have a couple of really large endeavors coming up in sort of the out years of our CIP that might warrant a design build or a PPP. And we may set more specific goals around that because it will be so project specific. So I think we have some opportunities there, but we're not quite there yet in our very white industry in the Twin Cities.
Yes, yeah. How about you, Maura?
We, the state of Wisconsin Department of Administration, which is different from the DOT, has very specific MBE goals, and they don't include women. They don't include Middle Eastern, people of Middle Eastern descent, and they have an excess goal of disadvantaged veterans business. So it's not structured the way the DOT program, which is all just disadvantaged in a certain percentage. And Milwaukee and Madison have higher goals than the rest of the state. That being said, that is firm ownership only, 51%. That does not really reflect diversity. And I tell people the story of my first interview in the state of Wisconsin, which was 6 teams. Okay, that happens very rarely, but they were all white males. And the only distinction between them was one guy wore a bow tie. And after a while, they do all start looking alike. And the only females that ever showed up in those first interview was the marketing chick who was in the back of the room giving them a thumbs up and a timer as to, cut it short and wrap it up. Since that time, I actually just had an interview for a $150 million engineering building where the dean of engineering was so impressed with the 2 top contending firms because they had so many women on the team. women lab planners, women project managers, women leaders. And actually, I think it influenced their vote. And that had nothing to do with meeting these well, we didn't have WBE goals, but and I think you find this in higher ed, is they're trying to attract minorities and females to the School of Engineering. What better way to do it than to have women be part of the design process, whether they're engineers or whether they're architects. So that diversity is coming about not because of a mandate, just because our world is finally getting there. And I think what a lot of firms don't realize is how much cachet that gives them. It's not measured. It's maybe not even responded to them. I actually bring it to architects. I said, you had all these women, or you had, these minority who's your chief, designer or project manager. That didn't fall on deaf ears. The dean and the, end user, they were impressed with that. So that's not measurable, but it's affecting everybody's perception.
Excellent. Thank you. And Edric, I would love to get your perspective.
Sure. Well, I've been with the city of Martinez for 6 months, so pretty new here, and they haven't really developed policies yet on how to integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion into our processes. But we do have a committee that was established, and I'm hoping that they would put out some sort of policies called ARTPI, the Anti-Racism and Discrimination and Pro-Inclusion and Equity Task Force. So I've been following that, and hopefully something will come out of it. But more importantly, for me, working for a public agency and working really for the public, I strongly believe that we should be looking the same as across the counter. To be able to get the perspective of others, I feel that you need a team to reflect that. And so when we begin designing our projects, we're able to integrate the various types of needs that come about from diversity. Other agencies that I've worked for before have integrated various types of elements, but among all of them, when there's federally funded projects through DOT, there's the DBE goal element of it. And just like Moara said, it's really about ownership and not necessarily about the makeup of the company. So there's some challenges with that. When I was a city engineer for City of Richmond, and also the deputy director for Alameda County, we had some emphasis on local hiring. And that was a nice element to incorporate into our process. And because we have to hire folks for the most qualified and most experienced, the way they went about addressing that was adding additional bonus points, basically, so that they might get that leg up when it comes down to all things being equal, that those firms that at least provide local hiring elements are brought in. I would hope something might come about for diversity as well. So I'm following very closely with ARTPI, and also working on a national level with American Public Works Association. I'm on their DEI committee, and we're looking at public works as an industry and trying to figure out ways for us to be able to, again, not only do better and put out projects that really benefit the public by having a diverse workforce, or hiring people that also represent the public. So it's a lot of moving parts at this point. So it's very exciting, and hopefully something will come about soon within this year.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, we're down to our last 5 minutes of the presentation, and I promised everyone here on the panel, as well as you at home or in your office, that we would end right on the nose. So this is sort of a lightning round with final thoughts. So I would love for each of you to share, and Maura, you can start on this final question. If there's one piece of advice or one piece of encouragement that you would give a team that's preparing for an interview, what is the most important thing in your mind?
The ability to showcase, this is the team that's made the short list, the ability to showcase how they work together. A lot of people say they're integrated planning model, integrated design model. It really shows in an interview. And there's one, somebody had mentioned in the past, we would have the same engineer on multiple interviews, and then somebody would pick one. And I'm like, but you had the same engineer. And they're like, yeah, but that engineer spoke. That engineer spoke with the architect. The two of them together talked and handed it off back and forth as to how they were approaching and that they were thinking about it rather than the engineer spoke for their 5 minutes. We even have people on interview committees that wouldn't even speak at all. And we'd say, why are you there? Why did you bring them to the meeting? So as long as it actually looks like the team worked together on the interview, then the chances are they're going to work together well in the subsequent project.
Excellent. Heather.
Here, Mara. I think that's a really good point. I want to say practice. I also want to say anticipate a little bit. I'm more impressed by people who maybe they answer the question that I've already got written in my Q&A script, and I don't have to ask it, or I get to ask a deeper question because they anticipated that in their presentation. But sometimes you don't know us well enough to anticipate what we're really going to be interested in until you start talking to us. So then listen, answer the questions that we ask. I mean, I can learn a lot if you just tell me the same thing you told me in the presentation when I ask a follow-up and I'm trying to get at a different thing and you won't go there with me. That tells me a lot, and that can be useful to me, but it may not serve you well if you're trying to work for me. So I think really paying attention to what we're asking, and it's a little bit harder when it's on screen to be sure. So have the guts to ask a follow-up if you're not sure what I'm really getting at. I'd rather know you're listening and really care to understand it than that you got it on the first pass, because I can offer you all kinds of grace for this platform being a little bit weird. I can't fix you not paying attention to me, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And Edric, your final thoughts.
Well, for the interview, definitely be prepared, be organized, but more importantly, I want the individuals to be very engaging, to be confident, to be clear and concise. It's nothing worse than someone rambling and going off on tangents. So engaging, confident, clear, and concise, and be prepared, and you'll do a good job.
Excellent. Well, on behalf of SagePresence and all of those who are watching, we want to thank our panelists here today. I would give a clap, and I'm sure if they could show their little hand claps in the Zoom world, you'd get a nice round of applause for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us today. So thank you very much to all of you for your insight. For those of you who are listening, if you do have any other questions as it relates to anything that we covered today, please feel free to reach out to SagePresence. We're happy to answer any questions that you might have. Also, if your questions were in the queue and they didn't get answered, I will take a look at making sure that we get you an answer via email as well. So on behalf of SagePresence, thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in today. And we hope you have a wonderful holiday and a very happy new year. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.